Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. Here we have AlphaZero as white and Stockfish 8 as black. So AlphaZero began d4, knight to f6, knight to f3, e6, c4, b6. We're heading into Queen's Indian territory here. g3, bishop e7, knight c3, bishop b7, bishop g2, castles, and now knight to e4 by Stockfish. And the point of knight e4 is just to prevent white from playing this move e4 in the future, which would get a lot of central space and central control. So therefore black plays knight e4 just to make this move illegal. Bishop to d2 was played, d5 once again clamping down on the e4 square. It does look a little bit counterintuitive, this pawn to d5 move, because it blocks in the bishop on b7. However, black's plan is actually to play c5 in the future, and it turns out that with pawns on c5 and d5, black would get a lot of central control. However, the pawns would actually be quite weak. So therefore, it's actually useful to have the bishop just to defend the pawn on d5, even if it is technically a bad bishop. C takes d5 by AlphaZero, E takes d5, and now queen to b3. And already AlphaZero's looking at this weak pawn, or potentially weak pawn on d5. Knight to a6. This looks a little bit weird until you realize that black's plan is to play c5, and therefore knight to a6 helps support that move, and therefore is very logical. Rook on f to d1 by AlphaZero. This is a nice move. Just looking at this pawn on d5, which after c5, which Stockfish played, bishop to f4, you can see that AlphaZero's plan, I think, is to just take on c5 in the future. And now this would give up a lot of central control. However, the pawn on d5 would be really weak. It would be under pressure from the knight, the queen, and the rook. So therefore it would be worth it just to give black this weakness. And Stockfish seemed to be quite spooked by this. It played c4, and this has its positives. Now the rook and the queen are sort of misplaced because the rook is just hitting its own pawn, and the queen isn't really putting pressure on d5 anymore. However, this bishop on b7 is now really bad. It's just hitting the pawn on d5, and the difference is, before now, if white were ever to take on c5, you can imagine that in the future black would be able to play d4, and then the bishop would be given an open diagonal. But after c4, you can see that the bishop is forever just going to be hitting that pawn on d5. And it really is just a really poor bishop now. So queen to c2 was played by AlphaZero, knight to b4, queen to c1, and now f6. Stockfish presumably didn't want a knight or bishop maybe getting into e5, but you can see that in playing f6, the drawback is some light squares have been weakened. And here AlphaZero looks at the position and it sort of thinks, well, what's black's best piece? And it's really this knight on e4. So AlphaZero decided to play knight to d2 to try and trade it off. First, knight takes e4 looks good, because after d takes e4, you've won a pawn and you've traded off black's piece, and you've won the pawn with check. But black would play bishop to d5 here, and all of a sudden the check has been blocked, the queen is attacked, the knight has been attacked, white is going to lose a piece. So therefore, after f6, knight to d2 was played by AlphaZero, and now f5 by Stockfish. And I find this move slightly surprising, really clamping down the protection of the knight on e4, but there's a huge drawback, which is the weakening of this e5 square, and this just turns out to be a wonderful home for the white bishop. That being said, if black were to take on c3, white would just take back, and after knight to c6, white gets in e4. Really nice central pawn lever, getting a lot of central control and undermining the pawn on c4. So therefore f5 was played, and now knight to f1, another really nice move. If we look at this position, AlphaZero thought, okay, where are the weaknesses in black's position? And it thought, which of my pieces could be improved? And it turns out, well, this pawn on d5 is still quite weak. The knight attacks it, the bishop potentially attacks it, and the knight on d2 is probably white's worst place, well, minor piece at least. So therefore, knight to f1, really nice move preparing to maneuver the knight to the much better e3 square, where it hits d5. Rook to c8 was played by Stockfish, knight to e3, and look at how all the minor pieces are working nicely here. Queen to d7, and now bishop to e5. And this, yeah, just look at all the minor pieces all doing nice jobs. Notice how every piece is working right now, and the rooks can come in the future. Knight to a6. Okay, so AlphaZero has managed to place nicely all of its minor pieces. So I guess it's time to try and get rid of black's best pieces. And this knight on e4 is a nice piece. You don't really want to take it off, say with knight takes e4, because then black would get the f file opened. Instead, AlphaZero just decided to give a kick with f3. Knight takes c3, b takes c3, knight to c7, and now f4. And this is quite a picturesque position. Just look, this bishop is really, really strong on e5. And the knight is nicely placed, hitting both these pawns, and the bishop puts pressure on d5. And as there's not many files open, the lack of rooks being active right now doesn't really matter, because black's rooks aren't active either, and white's rooks will become active in the future. Knight to e8 was played, a4, nice bit of prophylaxis, preventing any black counterplay with b5, b4. Knight to f6. Rook to f1, and I found this slightly counterintuitive, but AlphaZero prepared the pawn lever h3, g4, and just playing on the king side seemed slightly odd to me because of the bishop, you know, the bishop, the rook and the knight. Black has a lot of pieces on the king side. I thought that AlphaZero's plan would be to try for something like rook on f to b1 and a5, going for queenside play. But I think the main reason that the kingside play ended up working out is this bishop on e5 is just so powerful, and it allows the kingside play to just be utterly dominating. So rook to f7 was played, bishop to f3, preparing that g4 advance, rook cf8, h3, preparing g4, knight to e4, bishop takes knight, f takes knight, and g4. And nice kingside expansion here. White's king is completely safe despite pushing the pawns, mainly just due to the knight and the bishop, just excellent defenders and attackers. And please take a moment to compare the bishop on b7 and the bishop on e5. The bishop on b7 is really just awful. So it tries to activate itself, attack a4, and you know, here I would have thought just instantly a5, don't let the pawn be taken. But AlphaZero doesn't care, it just plays queen to e1. And yeah, after bishop takes a4, queen to g3, white's kingside play is just going to be stronger than black's queenside play. You know, black's only plan here is b5, b4, a5 kind of thing, trying to get counterplay, but it just turns out to be too slow. A5, h4, b5, f5, and now h6. And this is when you know things are going badly for black, because as black you want to be able to play something like b4, really trying to get counterplay. And the fact that instead h6 was played shows that Stockfish is having to go passive here, and it's really good to just passively defend. You need to try and get counterplay, though obviously it just wasn't going to work. Rook to f2, queen to d8, another just passive defensive move, trying to stop g5. g5 is played anyway, h takes g5, queen to g4, and now black's position is actually just collapsing. And in the game, believe it or not, Stockfish played b4, and yes, this does just hang the bishop on a4. If we go back here, you know, you'd think black would have something else to do except give up the bishop, but really doesn't. This bishop is awful, the rooks can hardly move, queen and bishop don't really want to move away from their defensive positions, and white's plan is simply to play rook to g2, and just, if black doesn't take on h4, just take on g5 and play g6. If black did take on h4, you would take on g7, and it's just overwhelming. And just to show you, if g takes h4 was played, rook to g2, which actually threatens queen takes g7 check. Bishop to f6, this is quite a long line, but it's forced, so it's worth showing you. Queen to h5 would be played, and this is a nice move because it opens up the g4 square for the knight, and the knight wants to get to h6, which would be very strong indeed. queen to e7, knight to g4, bishop to g5. You have to stop the move knight to h6. f6 would now be played, and black is just losing. Rook takes f6, bishop takes, rook takes, knight takes, bishop takes, queen takes d5. And though in some positions actually 2 bishops against 2 rooks can be surprisingly decent for the 2 bishops, here black is just completely lost. So therefore Stockfish played b4, but this does just give up the bishop on a4, and white is just clearly winning now. And let's just go through the last few moves to resignation. e3, rook f3, bishop h6, f6, that super strong pawn move once again. Rook takes, bishop takes, rook takes, rook af1, and here Stockfish resigned. So yeah, really interesting game, and thank you very much for watching.